Thank you very much, Don, and it's always great to be back in the city that my kids consider home. I'm anxious to hear the conversations here over the next couple of days. I'd like to thank Don and Joel for putting this together. I think it's an excellent idea to bring this event back together after 25 years and kind of look at the state of cities in terms of where we've come from as well as where we're going. Now, the first Remaking Cities Conference, as you heard, was 1988. That was 30 years after the steel industry started its decline, if you look at it in terms of jobs. Steel employment in this country peaked in 1958. And with every recession, it would drop. With every recovery, it would pop back up, never to the preceding level. So there was a sort of ratcheting down, as I call it, of the steel economy as measured by jobs in this country. The ratcheting down stopped in 1980 to 82 when the bottom fell out. This region lost 200,000 jobs out of its million-job base within 2 years. The J&L Second Avenue mill shut down. 5,000 people lost their jobs. That's now been reborn as the Pittsburgh Technology Center, although I think it has a different name now. Aliquippa, a mill down the Ohio River, once employed 18,000. And I could go on and on and on. Towns like Braddock, Rankin, and Aliquippa and others bore the brunt of those job losses. Now, by the end of the 1980s, something had happened that was quite remarkable. This region had regrown those 200,000 lost jobs. They had regrown it, even though the steel industry had not come back in terms of jobs. It had come back in terms of dollar value of steel. By 1990, more dollar value of steel was being produced in this region, inflation corrected, than in 1980. They had ceded the low-end steel to Brazil, South Korea. They had focused on highly automated mills at the high end. It was a sort of jobless recovery. So where did those jobs come from? They came from eds and meds, basically, as well as the corporate power that was still here at that time. We had 17 of the 19 Fortune 500 companies in the region located within a short walk of this hotel. Those corporations not only gave us the rank of number 3 in the country in terms of Fortune 500 companies, we were number 2 in terms of cities, since many of Chicago's were in the suburbs, but we were also number 2 in terms of capital controlled by those companies. We had the big ones. We had U.S. Steel, Westinghouse, Koppers, Alcoa, and I could go on with that list as well. That corporate commitment stayed for a period of time. One of Pittsburgh's challenges today is that Pittsburgh no longer has anything close to 19 Fortune 500 companies in this region. Pittsburgh is now outranked by places like Dallas. And so I see that as one of the challenges ahead when we look at the legacy cities, the Rust Belt cities, whatever we want to call them. But we had a program of a renaissance under Mayor Caligiuri. That's who I work for. But we also had Tom Forrester of the county, the university presidents, Wes Posvar, Dick Seiert, the Allegheny Conference on Community Development with Bob Pease's leadership, and I believe Bob is here at this conference. My boss, Bob Lurcott, the planning director, Paul Brophy as the development director, and I could go on and on and on with neighborhood leaders of philanthropy and the like. It was that leadership team that really helped this region understand how to get beyond the loss of those 200,000 jobs. By the way, when you lose 200,000 jobs out of a million, you end up with unemployment rates that are Depression era. And I don't think that any region in this country in the Great Recession lost 20% of its region's jobs. The other thing I wanted to point out here is when the jobs came back, they were different jobs held by different people located spatially in different locations. The jobs did not come back to Braddock and Rankin and Aliquippa. They did come back to downtown Pittsburgh, the Golden Triangle. They did come back to the Oakland area where the major health and education institutions reside. We did work using the IRS paired migration filing tapes, as they're called, in the mid-'80s to find out where Pittsburghers had gone. And we found they'd gone to Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, Atlanta, areas that were growing at that time. By 1990, when we had regrown 200,000 jobs, we wanted to know if Pittsburghers had come back home. We found out they had not. Those people came from Washington, D.C., New York City, and many of them from California. So the remaking of this place that we saw in the 1980s that continued then into the 90s was not just a remaking of the physical place or of the economy. It was a remaking of the people of the region as well. And that's a remaking, of course, that has always gone on in cities. It was mentioned earlier that we had a series of industrial cities that had grown, and then post-industrial cities where often they were shedding population. But I would go back one step further. Pittsburgh's very beginnings started as a center because of military and trade advantage, Fort Duquesne and then Fort Pitt. So by the time we were looking at the rebirth and reuse of the mill sites along the rivers, we were looking at the third generation. And the first two needed people. This was a magnet for people during those first two eras. More recently, as I mentioned, with the steel industry going to automated processes, even when you grow or regrow a part of an economy, often it's the sort of jobless recovery that comes with it. And I think that's one of the challenges we all face right now, and this panel will be talking about that. Psychologically, it took us a while to get through grieving because we had people whose families had seen generations go to work often in the same mill, grandfathers, fathers, and sons. You couldn't simply go in and start talking about redevelopment. And so we had to go through a period of collecting grieving before you could get to hope and start rebuilding your economy and those mill sites. We did work in Germany. We talked about the Ruhr Valley. A number of us in Pittsburgh went over there around 1990. They had come over and seen some of the redeveloped mill sites. We went over with practical lessons about how do you clean up a brownfield site? How do you do market studies to figure out what might replace it? The steel industry in Europe had not ratcheted down. With the rebuilding of Europe, it had been nothing but up, 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 until the oversupply worldwide led to a collapse of that industry in the late 80s, some years after the Pittsburgh steel industry had been ratcheting down and then collapsing. We found that the emotions that we were dealing with over there were two things. They asked us repeatedly in meeting after meeting, how did you find out who to blame, and how did you get back at them? And these were very real emotions. It was blame and retribution. They were not yet ready to deal with the realities of kind of where to go in the future. Several years later, they did it. They did it brilliantly. You can go over and see all sorts of redeveloped areas in that Ruhr area. But that taught me a lot of lessons about emotions when you're dealing as a planner with people's lives, with the kind of collective history of a place and the need to move on. So tomorrow you're going to have a lot of details about Pittsburgh, so I'll stop there with the mention of one other thing that I think is important, and that is Strategy 21, which was called an Economic Development Strategy for the 21st Century. That was issued in about 1984 by the city, the county, the major universities, and the Allegheny Conference, as well as the philanthropic sector. It was an intentional plan, an intentional strategy, and that's something else I think we ought to be talking about. I don't think recoveries just happen. They may be happening sporadically here or there, but I think when you're looking at the need for a rebirth of the magnitude that we saw here and that so many cities are struggling with, Detroit, that's been talked about today already, you need that type of an intentional effort, at least from time to time, and it takes the leadership that stretches from the neighborhoods to the corporate boardrooms to do that. So, we've got a great set of panelists here today. I've asked them each to introduce themselves along the way so that if they want to say something about themselves beyond what's in your program, they can do that as they make their own remarks. We'll go in the order that's in the program, as well as the seating order from Bruce Katz, Vice President and Director of the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institution, will speak first, followed by Angela Glover Blackwell, the founder and chief executive officer of PolicyLink, and finally Rip Rapson, president and CEO of the Kresge Foundation. I've had the privilege of working with both Bruce and Rip over the years. I certainly know very much of Angela's work. I've not had the pleasure of working directly with Angela. Perhaps at some other point we'll be able to do that as well.